A reminder, you can purchase Megha and Brit's books at the event page that brought you into this event. If you are watching our YouTube recording, you can purchase books in the description below. I finally get to do what YouTubers do. And you can also purchase some other great books from us online as well. And a reminder that select titles are available for curbside pickup. Not all titles are available for curbside pickup right now, but if you live in Southeast Michigan and want to drive up to the store, we've got curbside for select titles. In lieu of a book purchase, we also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. Whether you think of that $5 donation as a weekly subscription to our events or a monthly subscription or for the year, we'd appreciate that. It helps us sustain all these wonderful events that we've been able to set up while we can't present them to the public. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. So without further ado, Brit Bennett is the author of the New York Times bestselling novel, The Mothers, the finalist for the NBCC John Leonard Prize for Best First Book, the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction, and the New York Public Library Young Lions Award, and a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. Her work has been featured in The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, the Paris Review, and Jezebel. Megha Majumdar was born and raised in Kolkata, India. She moved to the United States to attend college at Harvard University, followed by graduate school in social anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. She works as an editor at Catapult and lives in New York City, and A Burning is her debut novel. Please use your clap reaction function to welcome both authors to your living rooms.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, I love that everybody was encouraged to use the clap function. So Brit, I know we just talked about this. We're both going to do readings, but would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. I will read something very short, and I'm just going to read from the opening pages of my new book, The Vanishing Half. So there will be no spoilers here. This is just the opening section. The morning one of the lost twins returned to Mallard, Lou LeBon ran to the diner to break the news. And even now, many years later, everyone remembers the shock of sweaty Lou pushing through the glass doors, chest heaving, neckline darkened with his own effort. The barely awake customers clamored around him, 10 or so, although more would lie and say that they'd been there too, if only to pretend that this once they'd witnessed something truly exciting. In that little farm town, nothing surprising ever happened, not since the Veen twins had disappeared. But that morning in April 1968, on his way to work, Lou spotted Desiree Veen walking along Partridge Road, carrying a small leather suitcase. She looked exactly the same as when she'd left at 16, still light, her skin the color of sand, barely wet. Her hipless body reminding him of a branch caught in a strong breeze. She was hurrying, her head bent, and Lou paused here, a bit of a showman. She was holding the hand of a girl, 7 or 8, and black as tar. Blue-black, he said, like she'd flown direct from Africa. Lou's egg house splintered into a dozen different conversations. The line cook wondered if it had been Desiree after all, since Lou was turning 60 in May and still too vain to wear his eyeglasses. The waitress said that it had to be. Even a blind man could spot a Veen girl, and it certainly couldn't have been that other one. The diners, abandoning grits and eggs on the counter, didn't care about that Veen foolishness. Who on earth was that dark child? Could she possibly be Desiree's? Well, who else's could it be, Lou said. He grabbed a handful of napkins from the dispenser, dabbing his damp forehead. Maybe it's an orphan that got took in. I just don't see how nothing that black could have come out Desiree. Desiree seemed like the type to take in no orphan to you? Of course she didn't. She was a selfish girl. If they remembered anything about Desiree, it was that, and most didn't recall much more. The twins had been gone 14 years, nearly as long as anyone had ever known them. Vanished from bed after the Founders' Day dance, while their mother slept right down the hall. One morning, the twins crowded in front of their bathroom mirror, 4 identical girls fussing with their hair. The next, the bed was empty, the covers pulled back like any other day. taut when Stella made it, crumpled when Desiree did. The town spent all morning searching for them, calling their names through the woods, wondering stupidly if they had been taken. Their disappearance seemed as sudden as the rapture, all of Mallard the sinners left behind. Naturally, the truth was neither sinister nor mystical. The twins soon surfaced in New Orleans, selfish girls running from responsibility. They wouldn't stay away long. City living would tire them out. They'd run out of money and gall and come sniffling back to their mother's porch. But they never returned again. Instead, after a year, the twins scattered, their lives splitting as evenly as their shared egg. Stella became white, and Desiree married the darkest man she could find. Now she was back, Lord knows why. Homesick, maybe. Missing her mother after all those years, or wanting to flaunt that dark daughter of hers. In Mallard, nobody married dark. Nobody left either, but Desiree had already done that. Marrying a dark man and dragging his blue-black child all over town was one step too far. In Lou's egg house, the crowd dissolved, the line cook snapping on his hairnet, the waitress counting nickels on the table, men in coveralls gulping coffee before heading out to the refinery. Lou leaned against the smudged window, staring out at the road. He ought to call Delvine. Didn't seem right for her to be ambushed by her own daughter, not after everything she'd already been through. Now Desiree and that dark child, Lord. He reached for the phone. You think they fixed him to stay? The line cook asked. Who knows? She sure seemed in a hurry, though, Lou said. Wonder what she hurrying to. Looked right past me, didn't wave or nothing. Uppity. And what reason she got to be uppity? Lord, Lou said. I never seen a child that black before. Thank you. That's just a little bit from the opening section of the book. Thank you.
That was gorgeous, Brit. And I would love to sneak in a question before I do my reading, which is, you just introduced us to this town, which has something very particular about it. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that town? And I have been thinking about, how did you arrive at the idea for this town?
Sure. So I thought about the idea from the town actually from a conversation I had with my mother, who offhandedly mentioned to me about a town that she remembered from her childhood in Louisiana, where everyone intermarried so that their children would get lighter and lighter with each generation. And it was something that was so disturbing and striking, and as you said, particular, which I think often can be the basis of a story. So I started to kind of think about what it would be like to live in that town and also to leave that town. Who are the people who stay? Who are the people who leave? What happens when this ideology is actually sort of enforced and instituted in a place? So in the beginning of the novel, you're kind of introduced to this town when this person who has left has returned to it, Desiree, and you see the stir that this causes amongst this town.
Yeah, I hope this is not too much of an awkward transition, but
no, you're fine.
I'm just going to read from my book, and then Brit, you and I can chat some more.
Awesome.
So I'll read from my book, which is called A Burning, and I will also read just a tiny bit from the start. You smell like smoke, my mother said to me. An oval of soap in my hair and poured a whole bucket of water on myself before a neighbor complained that I was wasting the morning supply. There was a curfew that day. On the main street, a police jeep would creep by every half hour. Daily wage laborers compelled to work would come home with arms raised to show they had no weapons. In bed, my wet hair spread on the pillow, I picked up my new phone, purchased with my own salary, screen guard still attached. On Facebook, there was only one conversation. These terrorists attacked the wrong neighborhood. The more I scrolled, the more Facebook unrolled. The night before, I had been at the railway station, no more than a 15-minute walk from my house. I ought to have seen the men who stole up to the open windows and threw flaming torches into the halted train, but all I saw were carriages burning, their doors locked from the outside and dangerously hot. The fire spread to huts bordering the station, smoke filling the chests of those who lived there. More than 100 people died. The government promised compensation to the families of the dead, 80,000 rupees, which, well, the government promises many things. In a video to the dozen microphones thrust at his chin, the chief minister was saying, "Let the authorities investigate." Somebody had spliced this comment with a video of policemen scratching their heads. It made me laugh. I admired these strangers on Facebook who said anything they wanted to. They were not afraid of making jokes. Whether it was about the police or about the ministers, they had their fun, and wasn't that freedom? Then in a video clip further down the page, a woman came forward, her hair flying, her nose running, her eyes red. She was standing on the sloping platform of our small railway station, and into the microphone she screamed, "There was a jeep full of policemen right there. Ask them why they stood around and watched while my husband burned. He tried to open the door and save my daughter. He tried." I shared that video. I added a caption. "Policemen paid by the government watched and did nothing while this innocent woman lost everything," I wrote. I laid the phone next to my head and dozed. The heat brought sleep to my eyes. When I checked my phone next, there were only 2 likes. A half hour later, still 2 likes. Under my thumb, I watched post after post about the train attack, earn 50 likes, 100 likes, 300 likes. Nobody liked my reply. And then in the small, glowing screen, I wrote a foolish thing. I wrote a dangerous thing, a thing nobody like me should ever think, let alone write. Forgive me, Ma. If the police didn't help ordinary people like you and me, if the police watched them die, doesn't that mean, I wrote on Facebook, that the government is also a terrorist? I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Your book really begins in such a bracing way, and I think in also such a relatable way of somebody, expressing a politically controversial and politically dangerous opinion on Facebook. So I found that really interesting and also pertinent to this moment of online activism and also the risks and the dangers of that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brit. I feel like it has acquired eerie resonances, even though, of course, I started writing this in a very different time and about a very different country.
Right.
But yeah, so I have a lot of questions jotted down about yoga.
Okay.
And I guess one place to start, one thing that I was so curious about is how did you become interested in the American history of passing as a subject for your fiction?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, I think about the first thing that I think I ever really encountered about passing was probably the movie Imitation of Life. I don't know if anyone has seen it. There are 2 versions. There's a version in the 30s that's black and white, and there's a version in the 50s that's in color, and that's the version I saw when I was a kid. And there's it's actually a subplot of that movie of this character who disavows her dark-skinned mother and decides to pass for white. But that, I think, is what people remember most about this movie. Like, nobody really talks about the kind of A plot, which is about this woman who kind of becomes like an entrepreneur or something. No one really talks about that. Everyone kind of fixates on this story of passing. I think that's what's really memorable about that story. So I watched that as a kid, and it really stuck with me. I thought it was very strange. I didn't understand why somebody would do this. And obviously, as I got older and I began to understand the larger context, which was very different than my own upbringing in the 90s, when I started to think about the larger context, I became kind of interested in that question of what it means to become somebody else. And not only that, but what you lose in doing so.
Yeah. And so I am in the middle of your book. I haven't finished it yet, so
Yes.
no spoilers. But one thing that I am so struck by is how the structure, as the book goes along, you loop in so beautifully these love stories, childhood stories, and I'm so curious to learn from a craft perspective your process of working on this structure.
Thank you. It took a while to figure out. I'm not going to lie. It took many drafts, in part because of what you're saying. There are lots of different narrators. There are different timelines that I was kind of juggling, because I knew I didn't want to write like a strictly chronological story. So then it was like, well, how do you move between time without confusing people? But I like books that do that. I like having time jumps and narrative and trying to figure out what's happened to characters since you saw them last. I like that type of effect, particularly in a story like this that takes on different generations, and it kind of lends itself to a little bit more expansiveness, maybe in the timeline. So a lot of it was just a lot of effort over years of trying to figure out what worked. I always knew that I wanted to start with that scene that I just read for everybody, which is Desiree returning after these years of absence. And a few people have pointed out this sort of similarity to the beginning of Their Eyes Were Watching God, which wasn't something that I intended to kind of connect it to, but I think that the opening of that novel works for a certain reason. The idea of a person who has been gone for years, they've returned to this town under like mysterious circumstances, and you don't know what they've been up to since you've seen them last. That's kind of a iconic and also useful way to begin a story. So I knew I wanted to start there. I knew that I needed these storylines to merge in some way. And we won't say how they merge now because nobody has read the book. But I needed them to merge. So I kind of thought about those sort of pivot points. Where are these characters intersecting? Where are they meeting? Where are they kind of scattering, like balls in like a pool table, like they're knocking into each other and scattering off at these angles? Where those moments those things are happening?
I will keep that pool table image with me because that is so helpful, like in my book, it's about three people, and I needed their lives to have that kind of intersection too. Yeah. But at the same time, I spent so much time and I worked so hard on making sure that, each person has a distinct arc. So how can I make them meet in a way which feels meaningful and rich?
Yeah. Well, can we talk about that a little bit? Because I think also your book, you have these multiple narrators that you are sort of moving between and among. And these characters are kind of orbiting each other in these interesting ways. So I want to know, as I was reading, why were these the narrators that you chose specifically to tell this story? There could have been lots of ways these lives sort of intersected with the story. So if you could tell the people maybe a little bit about the narrators and why you chose those narrators, what interested you about them?
Yeah. I started out wanting to write a book which would explore how ordinary people confront the might of the state, how ordinary people defy the constraints that these oppressive and discriminatory systems place upon them. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of had three starting questions, and that led to each character. Okay. So one question that I had was, how does somebody who gains a little bit of political power in this society with huge power differentials, what will they do? Who will they betray? What morals will they surrender? So that was kind of one question that I had, and that is one character in the book. Another question that I had was, I wanted to look at how somebody who works really hard and really earnestly is still challenged and in some cases defeated by the systems that they live within. Mm-hmm. So this idea that all you have to do to get ahead is work really hard. I feel like many of us have given up on that a long time ago. But I just, I just wanted to see how you can do everything right, but it's not always up to the individual. And then the third character, I just wanted to write this joyous, bold, defiant arc of somebody who lives at the very margins of society, who wants to go to its very center and become a movie star. And how does this person who is marginalized in all of these complex ways, how does she chase this dream?
Mm-hmm. No, that's awesome. Yeah. And can I ask also, there are also different points of view that you chose. So some of them are first person, some of them are close third. How did you choose that for each character, and why did you choose to make it different instead of writing the whole book in one sort of point of view?
Oh, such a writerly thing to notice.
No, I'm sorry if this is too like boring and nerdy for people listening, but
I felt that the two characters who are in first person, I needed to be very close to their pain and their success. And so I felt like first person was what felt right. And one of them, her voice is kind of broken, kind of aspirational. It's non-standard English. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to show how this register of aspiration, you know, like in India, where so many of us have a first language that's not English, English becomes this language that you're constantly told it's the language of the future. It's the language of power. Moving up in life. Yeah, exactly. The language of power. And so I had to show how her striving is kind of part of her English. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then the character that I wrote in third, I wanted some critical distance because I felt that I was writing somebody who was doing really reprehensible things, but I didn't want to write a flat, villainous character.
Yeah, that makes sense. That totally makes sense.
Can I turn that back on you? This is, sure. Your book is in such a beautiful and close third. Did you ever write it from different points of view or in a different way?
Well, I will say, so if anybody has read the book or finished the book, maybe there is, I don't think this is a spoiler, but there's a section from the point of view of one of the daughters, I'll say, to keep this very vague. And that was the only section I originally wrote in the first person because this character is so far outside the orbit of the rest of the book that it took me to kind of writing in first person to understand her a little bit and to capture kind of the chattiness of her voice, the energy. She is somebody who, like the character you were describing, she wants to be an actor. So I think having this character who is a bit extroverted and very chatty and just kind of the type of person who never stops talking, writing that in the first person, I think allowed me to kind of get at that a little bit and recreate that. And then I ended up transposing it back into third, into a close third. But it's I think you can still kind of hear that voice in the close third and feel like that voice is different than the voice of the rest of the book. So for me, I think it was maybe less about voice and more about character and figuring out who she was and writing it in first person. But the rest of all of the book is in a third. That was just something I kind of played with, I think.
Yeah. And you were writing this book, I don't know if you started before The Mothers came out or if you started it around when it came out, but you were writing this after success of your first book. I mean, it was a bestseller. It was widely adored and rightfully so. What was the process like of writing this second book?
Yeah, I started this second book before The Mothers came out. So I'd kind of had the idea for it. I wasn't deep into it, but I kind of had the idea. And I was sort of playing with it. And I think that it was helpful for me to have something else to be thinking about when my debut book was coming out, because it gave me a little bit of separation between myself and the mothers, which I think was helpful. And it gave me something else to be focusing on besides like, oh, does everyone like my book? Do they hate my, give me a little bit of that separation. So I'm fortunate that I was able to start it before I kind of got swept up in the craziness that became The Mothers. And, you know, it was a different process. I think that writing a second book is, I'm sorry to say, I felt like it was a lot harder than the first book.
No, Brit, this is not what you're supposed to say here.
I know, I'm really sorry to say this. Maybe, I hope this won't be your experience. But for me, it was like the first book I was writing in like secrecy, you know, I didn't have an agent. I didn't have anybody who was like expecting it, you know? So you're just working on your first book by yourself and then, you know, hoping that somebody will buy it and hoping that people will like it. And all of that is just aspirational and hypothetical. And then when you're going into a second book, you've got a little bit of reality there and you become more aware of the good things that can happen and the bad things that can happen. And also just like aware of, you know, like I hope you don't experience the self-consciousness, but you are currently experiencing, you know, all the beloved praise for this book, which I think is a great feeling. But also sometimes when you're going to follow up on something after you've done something that's been praised, it does put a little bit of pressure on you that wasn't there before, or at least it did for me. Let me not project.
No, what you said about writing your first book in privacy and secrecy, that was exactly how it has been for me. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to kind of pay attention to and take note of how that changes. But something that I really wanted from this conversation, which I know you said that writing a second book is hard, but what advice do you have for somebody writing a second book?
Yeah, what advice do I have? I think you, honestly, I don't know how helpful this is going to be, but I just think you have to write as if there is no audience, you know, you have to just not think, you can't think about, because I think what you'll feel, or at least what I felt, was pressure in a few different directions. Like on one side, there were all the things that people liked about your first book. And you're like, I don't want to disappoint those people who liked these things about my first book. The second hand, you know, you want to do something different. Like, I'm sure you don't want to write the same book that you just wrote. You want to challenge yourself. You want to take on a new story or a new form or, you know, a new setting or whatever you want to do that's different. So eventually I just had to reach a point of learning to try to write as if there was no audience, as if nobody was going to read it, writing to please only myself. I had to kind of put myself in that time frame, or that mind frame, excuse me. And, you know, I think it helped, like, I try not to read reviews. I think that they can be instructive, but I think that they're for readers more than they're for the writer herself. So I think that I tried to not read it, and I think in part because I don't think it's the best headspace for a writer to know every good thing and every bad thing that people think about your work. You know, like, you have those conversations with your agent, you have them with your editor, you have people who are giving you feedback all the time. But, you know, I didn't want to get too caught up in what people were saying about the book if I could avoid it. Like I said, whether it was praise or criticism, I just wanted to be writing in a space where I wanted to write the book, you know, the Toni Morrison quote of, you know, writing the book that you want to read. But I wanted to write the book that I wanted to read. I wanted to write something that really pleased me and challenged me, instead of feeling like I had to follow up on the mothers in some way.
Yeah. Wise words. I will keep them close. Can I ask what the process of publishing this book, or, like, you know, letting this book into the world at this moment has been like for you?
Yeah, it's been surreal. That's the best way I can describe it. I mean, I think on one hand you have the sort of pandemic, the pandemic of it all, which, you know, we're living through this, you know, it's such a cliche now, but unprecedented times. Like, we are living through this generational crisis that has been so devastating and also just, like, mentally crushing in a lot of ways. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's also this aspect of all of the current unrest, the protests that are happening right now. And I think that has been, I think, maybe the most surreal aspect for me, because I had a few months to kind of adjust to quarantine and adjust to the reality that I was going to be publishing during this pandemic. And I had mentally, I think, adjusted to that. But you know, my book opens in 1968. It opens in the wake of the protests after Dr. King was assassinated. And the fact that this book is now being discussed as timely is something that I never in my wildest dreams imagined. You know, the idea that the questions that it's asking about, you know, again, 1968 and you know, it spans from about 1968 to like the late 80s, early 90s. So it covers an amount of time, but I didn't think that it would be discussed as a timely book. So I think that is something that has been deeply surreal and yeah, surprising for me just to experience. Can I ask you the same question? Because as you were saying, like your book is interested in the idea of a person going up against an oppressive state. It's interested in politics, power. So, you know, what has been the experience for you, especially this being your debut novel? What has been that experience of publishing at this time?
Like you, I feel like the word surreal pops in my head a lot. I do think that one thing I've been thinking about is just how strange it is that I started writing this book while looking at the rise of the right wing in India and recognizing, you know, the increasing hold of this ideology that's a hate-filled, xenophobic ideology, and looking at that in India and writing this book in response to that, and then seeing how closely the American situation right now mirrors what has been going on in India too. And one thing I've been thinking about is, I think a few people are surprised to hear this, but there are really close links between Hindu nationalism and white supremacy. They are both, you know, these ideas of quote unquote pure race. And, you know, they both involve fear of being replaced by other groups and all that kind of stuff. There are journalists and scholars doing work on this. So it feels really strange, you know? And I also, you know, this being a debut, like you understand that there is so much at stake for you. You know, there is so much hope that is bound up in your first book, probably in all your books. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you know, with the pandemic, I definitely recognized that, you know, the book is landing at a moment which is about things which are so much bigger than me, you know? So I realized that people were grappling with relatives who were really sick, or, you know, relatives they had lost, and they were, and now, of course, people are grappling with the depth of staggering injustice and police brutality and violence in this country. And so, you know, these huge questions are at stake, and I feel like all I can hope for is that people find that the book is a helpful instrument with which to think about injustice, and also how people still dream and still laugh and, you know, still love who they love in these times.
Absolutely.
How do you feel about opening up to questions?
Yeah, I'm happy if there's anybody else questions for either of us. Happy.
Yeah, there's some questions already, and I'll just encourage people to continue to ask them in the chat. They go to me. You don't have to be. People are really shy in Q&As, and they're even shy in Q&As.
On Zoom.
Calls. But you know, if you're worried about your wording, maybe I can try to be an editor. Maybe not as good as Megha is, but I'll do my best. So let me find a question that's maybe for both of you. Yeah, from Patricia. You're both so young. How did the experience of family history / stories influence what you choose to write about?
Okay, I can tackle that one first. Yeah, you know, I think I am often writing toward my family in some way. You know, like I said, my conversation with my mother is what sparked this book, and thinking about her upbringing in rural Louisiana and her experience of race down there, which was so different from mine growing up in San Diego in the 90s. And I think also thinking about sisterhood. You know, my mom was one of 9 children, and she and her sister my Aunt Liz, they were the only two to leave Louisiana and move to California, and that's where my mom met my dad. But I think I've always been kind of curious of what would have happened to my mom's life if she would have stayed in Louisiana instead of going to California. Obviously, I wouldn't be here because she wouldn't have met my dad. But that kind of question of, a sister who stays at home and a sister who leaves, and what that does to the family, I think that those are things that I drew on my own family history to kind of grapple with in this book.
For me, I grew up in a middle-class family in Kolkata, in India, and from a very early age, we were really encouraged to pay attention to the news. We often talked about the news at the dinner table. My parents never guarded the reality of where we lived from us, so we watched what they watched. And I think that practice of just paying attention to the world, paying attention to the news, has nourished this book in so many ways, because in a lot of ways, this book really grew out of watching what was happening in the news. There are things here I talk about which are drawn from incidents that I read about in the news, and I think it started at those dinner table conversations in some way.
It's a question for Megha. What is it like to be both a writer and an editor? How is the novel shaped by the experiences you've had bringing other people's books into the world? This is from Maggie.
That's a great question. I think being an editor has made me a sharper reader. I read a lot of manuscripts, and I'm very attentive to what moves me, what kind of surprise do I enjoy in sentences, what kind of pace do I feel myself drawn to. So I kind of had this ideal of what I wanted to accomplish in my book. And I was very attentive to how I wanted to earn a reader's attention and earn a reader's time on every page. I really saw my book as this act of invitation, and I wanted that invitation to be renewed on every page and in every chapter. And then there's something just kind of harder to name and just so beautiful about being so close to somebody else's work. As an editor, you take on work because you are that writer's fan. You read something and you think, this is beautiful. I want to tell people about it. I want to put this in other people's hands. So being so close to the mind of someone whose thought process, whose aesthetics, whose politics you admire, there is definitely something so instructive in that.
And maybe I can adapt this question for Brit in a way. You're going through the process of publishing 2 novels and then having those novels edited, and it's that process is a bit different than perhaps the process of workshop, which is a bit different than the process of being your own editor. And then, so I'm curious about how that shapes your reading life or your ability to be influenced by, you know how the sausage is made with 2 books. And so when you read new books, you have readerly insights that perhaps some of us don't have, having not been through that process. So I'm wondering if there is a kind of like a weird way that those processes shift the way you read and then reflexively shift the way you write. If that makes sense.
I mean, I do. I think it does. I think that, for me, the experience of I think that one of the things that I have had to learn over the course of 2 books is how to be edited. And I think that that's something that people who are regularly freelancing or write regularly and work with editors have learned how to do. But for me as a novelist, like I said, written this one book kind of in secrecy. And I wasn't used to the experience of actually being actively edited. So I think that it is something that you learn. And for me, it gave me appreciation for my editor, who's great. And who helped me a lot on the Vanishing half, because it took so much wrangling of us to get this story in shape. There were so many pieces we had to figure out how to move around. It took us so many drafts and many years to figure that out. So it gave me appreciation for my editor. At the same time, I think that unfortunately the way that it's affected my reading is that sometimes you're reading books that you can tell were not edited well, or sometimes it feels like they were not edited at all. So sometimes when I'm reading a book, I'm often not as critical towards the writer. I'm often more critical towards the editors that you feel didn't give the book the kind of attention that it deserved, because I think that, editing something well, it's an attentiveness, I think that it's an attentiveness to what the writer's attempting to do and helping them accomplish that. So not to lay all of the blame at the feet of the editors, but I think maybe a more enthusiastic way of saying this is that it gives me appreciation for really well edited work, and understanding the active collaboration that goes into editing and how special it is to have a good editor.
Thank you. There's a question for you both. What advice do you have for writers who are finishing their first novels? So maybe we can extrapolate that to mean maybe the craft process of finishing something, and then I imagine that possibly entails the process of going about submitting. I don't know if you want to talk about agent representation, things like that, but what next steps for someone who's putting a bow on their first book?
I think the best advice I could give is finding trusted friends to read it. That was really important for me, was having my friends whose taste I trusted and whose friendship I trusted. I trusted them enough to be honest with me. I had them read The Mothers, and they were the ones who were kind of like, yeah, it's ready, send it off to an agent. So I think that is really a crucial step, and you realize how rare that is, because there are lots of friends that really love you, but they're not going to sit down and read your novel, like that doesn't, that's not to say that they're not good friends, but it is a certain type of friend who will read and engage with your work really thoughtfully and give you honest feedback. So I think if you have people like that in your life, it's important to, especially people who are non-writers, if you have them, people who are readers, who are just going to give you their opinion as a reader, I think that can be a really valuable step in between kind of finishing your draft and moving to the, I guess, more professional publication space.
That's really good advice. And I would just add maybe something that I found really helpful was to pay attention to the things, pay attention to things like clarity, like in your opening pages. Is it clear where we are, what time period it is, who the characters are, and also very importantly, why should we care? I think when you submit your book to an agent and then after that to an editor, everybody is just swamped with manuscripts. And so your opening pages will really determine the level of enthusiasm that people have for your book, I think. And, asking that hard question of why would anybody care about this book? It's a hard question to ask, a thing which like holds your mind and heart, but I found it really helpful to be kind of relentless with that question. And also to ask while I was reading my pages at the end, where am I bored? Like where do I have that impulse to, I want to put this down? Because if you're bored, your reader will be bored. So just having the opportunity to make these final trims and cuts and kind of, make your book as close to its center and core as possible, I think that's very helpful.
I have a question for Brit, and then a question for Megha, and then a question for both of you, a couple questions for both of you. So I think that can maybe take us through the hour. Just giving you my menu here. This is from Zoe, one for Brit. Nadia, Luke, and Aubrey and their worlds were so vivid to me as a reader, and I often think of them almost like they were people I knew. As a writer, how do you say farewell to these people and this world you've created over the years and move on to book 2 and a new world? Do you still think about those first book characters and ongoing stories for them? And also, when can you come to Australia for a tour?
Well, first of all, thank you. That's so sweet. It is still very surreal for me to hear people say that about these characters that lived only in my mind for many years. To hear that people had an emotional connection to them, that's really special. I think it can honestly be very hard to move on from characters. I feel sometimes when I'm finishing a project, I do feel like this small sense of grief of having to step away from these characters that you grow to care about, even if you don't grow to necessarily love them. So I think that it can be difficult in that way. But I'm always, thinking about what's next and what I want to do next. So I have to kind of wrench myself away a little bit. But I've been thinking about those three a little bit more recently. I've received a few questions about them, and I think my favorite was asking what they would be doing in quarantine, which allowed me to imagine various scenarios, including the awful, Aubrey and Luke stuck together in a house sort of storyline that would be. They would both be completely very miserable right now. So I think that's kind of the steps I have to take of just allowing myself that space to feel a little bit sad when I'm moving on from those characters, but always being excited to encounter new characters. And as far as Australia, I hope soon. I was for the Sydney Writers Festival a few years ago, had the time of my life. It was a beautiful, beautiful city. And it was a great festival and a great program. So I really hope that I'll be back sometime soon. Pandemic willing, I will be back in Australia sometime soon. Thank you.
Someone just chimed in to say that the pandemic, the quarantine aspect might be a great opportunity for a short story. So
That's true. I mean,
the market for prompts.
I mean, I'm still in quarantine here in New York. What else do I have to do? So that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
A question for Megha, for Mina. Congrats on receiving rave reviews in the UA. I was wondering what the response was from critics, from Indian critics, and maybe Indian other fellow writers, etc., in addition to maybe just the press per se.
It's early days in India. The book won't be out in India until later this month. But I think wow, it's a little odd being asked to comment on my reviews, but it's it has received good early attention. I've been really grateful for it. I've had
Looks like we may have you froze there. Brit, is that the case for you as well?
Yeah.
Okay,
So.
we'll see if we can get that fixed. Oh, maybe. Oh, yeah. Sorry, you
back?
dropped out for just a second. Sorry. So we missed none of your answers. So I don't mean to make you repeat it again. But if you want to give us the cliff notes, feel free.
Sure. Oh, just that, early attention has been good. And I meant for this book to be legible to readers in the US, readers who have never been to India, don't follow Indian politics. I wanted them to connect to these characters. And at the same time, I wanted it to be rich and meaningful to those who do live in India and to see something of that truth reflected in the book. So I've been grateful for some very generous early attention.
We have a sort of the classic quarantine question, which is for both of you, what media are you consuming right now? So how are you occupying your time? Books, TV, movies, podcasts? I like that this is multi-medium, but I will say if you have books to recommend, people can look for those books on Literati Bookstore's website to purchase.
So I am fortunate. It was very difficult for me to start reading, to finish anything at the very beginning of quarantine. I have no attention span. My attention span has finally returned. So I've been able to get into some good books. I really love The Glass Hotel, which came out a couple of months ago, which you can buy at Literati. I love The Glass Hotel. It's a really propulsive novel about a Ponzi scheme. It's beautifully written, and Also, just that was the first book that I finished in quarantine that I didn't stop reading every 5 seconds to check my phone and read more about how many cases as they were skyrocketing in New York. So that's a great book. I also really love the book Actress by Anne Enright, which my friend Mairead, former bookseller at Literati, recommended to me. And I love that book. It's about the daughter of a Irish theater legend as she's kind of grappling with her mother's death and her murky legacy. So those are 2 books that I really loved. As far as TV, I've been, perhaps appropriately, I don't know, I've been rewatching The Wire during quarantine, so it has taken on a new sort of feel as you're watching it and having all of these conversations about the nature of policing and the institution of police. So I've been rewatching that, and yeah, I've been watching a lot of like movies, like old movies that I mean old. Most of these are like 80s, 90s movies that I just had never seen, which I will not admit right now because I will be judged very harshly. But I've been catching up on those types of movies that people would be aghast to hear that I've never seen. So that's been fun. I've been and then I guess briefly podcasts. I love The Read, which is just a really fun pop culture and gossip podcast that also takes on some tough issues like all the protests going on right now. So that's been pretty much me.
It's so funny that the person who asked about TV, because I think while I was writing the book, I was very attentive to TV shows and, you know, that culture of just hearing people say that they were binge watching a show. And I was very interested in taking craft lessons from TV shows, you know, like how can you keep people moving along? And Brit, your book, I do not mean to impose an influence on your book, but like your book definitely has that current where you like keep turning the pages too. So I definitely wanted that kind of velocity. And I think that came from watching shows like Mad Men at the time, which I think everybody was watching. But for right now, I have this book right here, which I can show you. So this is a book that I read. It is so good. It's called Luster. It's by Raven Lalani. It's shiny. And you can pre-order it if you like. It's out in August. And it's this hilarious, sharp, cutting book. I remember that there's a line in it about debt. So it's a really brilliant book, and I'm very excited about it.
I love that book too.
Well, thank you both. I think that brings us exactly to the hour. So we'll wrap up here. I just want to thank everyone again for asking really wonderful questions, for participating, for being here, for supporting our events. Once again, you can purchase Brit and Megha's new novels at our website, literatibookstore.com. There is a donate function. People are asking about donating. That's our GoFundMe is linked on our website. It should be on the left side, on the sidebar there. And the books that that Megha and Brit mentioned that they're reading are also available to order from Literati Bookstore as well. And you can find also more resources, other bookstores to support during this time on our website. That's all I have. Thank you both for such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much.
I hope to see you both in Ann Arbor soon.
Yes. I hope to.
Yeah, and it would be wonderful to have you. Stay safe. Thanks again. Thanks for all for tuning in. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Take care, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Have a great evening all. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Bye.